to another episode of our CEP in Conversation. And today we're really pleased to be joined by Burgess, who is from Salway Evangelical Church. And we're going to be talking a little bit about Holy Communion, Eucharist. People call it different things. But thank you for joining us. Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and what you do, your church?
Yeah, I'd love to. Hi, Helen. Good to see you. So, as you said, my name is Anne, and I am the family and community worker at Salway Evangelical Church. But before that, I was just a member. So my family goes there. I'm married. I've got 3 grown-up children in their 20s, and they are all also members of the church. So we still go kind of as a family. We don't all live in the same place, but yeah, that's us.
Brilliant, thank you. So tell us a bit, first of all, about how communion is celebrated at your church. For example, how often or how it's done, what happens?
So our church is an independent evangelical church. So we're not very formal in what we do, but we do have a set pattern, and we celebrate communion once a month. On a Sunday morning. It's the second Sunday of the month, so everyone remembers, hopefully that's when it is, and it's just incorporated into the normal Sunday morning service. So it tends to make the service a little bit longer, but the service is a little bit adapted to fit it in. And we don't have any special celebrant. Whoever is leading the service that day, whoever is on the rota to do that, is the person who leads us through communion. We don't have any set words or music. Quite often we might use some of the form of maybe the Anglican service, because that's nice and puts everything in order, but we don't have to. Some people deliberately don't do that, but have their own sort of order of things they do it in, although we always have the bread first and the wine after. Sometimes we do it in silence, sometimes we have music. And so it does slightly depend on who's leading it, the exact form that it takes.
Brilliant, thank you. So obviously a really important part of communion is the bread and the wine. But in different churches, sometimes people use bread like you'd get in the bakers, like rolls or something, and sometimes it's specific wafers. Sometimes it's wine, as you would know it from maybe even in a restaurant or something, you know, a bottle of wine, and sometimes it's more like grape juice. How is it at your church, and is there a reason why?
That's an interesting question, because we have actually changed how we've done it over the years. So when I first went to Salway 20 odd years ago, we used to use a fortified wine like lots of churches do, like something like sherry or port, and just a regular loaf of Sainsburys bread, like a big one, and the person celebrating it would kind of rip it into 4 bits. It'd be partly cut, pre-cut for them, but it always looked very dramatic. And but maybe 10 or 15 years ago, we changed the wine element, and I think that is because some people can't take wine. Maybe they don't like to take any alcohol. Some people have a problem with alcohol, so either they can't take that element, or if they take it, it might send them into a spiral of abusing alcohol. So we changed it to grape juice, so that everybody can be included and everybody can take the whole thing. And then a year or 2 ago, we went from using that big Sainsbury's bakery loaf to using a gluten-free loaf. I think is sourdough gluten-free. But anyway, whatever it is, we use gluten-free because, again, we became aware that some people can't take the whole thing because, you know, they can't take the bread that we're offering. And so we've changed it. The most important thing is that it's inclusive, that everybody can take it. So we've adjusted what we have so that everybody can take it.
Great. Yeah, it's really important that everyone can take part, isn't it? Talking about taking part and who can take part, obviously one of you were saying that you work with the families and that includes children. Do children take part in communion at your church, and maybe what age, or, you know, what kind of parameters are there around that?
So children tend not to, because they're out in their Sunday school groups when the service goes on to that communion part. And it's probably considered in our church that is the most appropriate time when the adults can be quiet and reflective and really think about the meaning of it. Children tend not to be there. The one time that children are there when we take communion is Good Friday. So they will be there then, but they are not encouraged to take it. We might pray a blessing over them. Really, the reason for that is because it's considered something that you have to think about and understand for yourself before you take part in it. You have to believe in it. And quite often people believe in it because their parents tell them, but we want them to really take that belief on for themselves, that you've thought it through. So having said that children aren't encouraged to take it, that we don't say you can take it when you're 12 or 14 or 16, it's whenever you feel ready. So our teenagers are not restricted from taking it, but we don't have a formal confirmation. Some churches have a formal sort of confirmation. We don't have that. It's when you feel that I believe this for myself. So it's at your discretion and with the agreement of your parents that you will join in with it.
Brilliant. And sort of ties into the next question. Would that be the same for adults? Say an adult sort of walked in off the street and kind of, wanted to join in, but they have to, in some churches they have to be baptized, for example. Is it just the same with adults as it would be for children, or is there anything different?
So some churches also say you have to be a signed up member. You have to have joined our membership list to do it. And we don't say that. We leave it to each person to sort of make their own decision before God. So in each communion service, we sort of say, if you trust in the Lord Jesus as your personal saviour, then please join us. You're part of God's family, join us in this. If you're not sure, or if you're not in the right frame of mind to do this today, then just let it go by you. So for us, we don't sort of go queue up. People, sort of stewards, bring the elements to the people, and they all get passed along the rows in church. So it's very easy to just pass it on to the next person without anyone really seeing or drawing attention to themselves. So it's quite easy to do that.
Brilliant, thanks. So we've discussed in your church general, like who can take it, and just sort of hypothetical examples, if you like. Talking about you personally as a Christian, why is it important to you when you take communion?
That's a great question. And there are a number of good answers, I have to say. So I'm going to try and just take you through my own personal feeling why it's important for me. The first thing is that we're told to do it in the Bible. In fact, we were told to do it by Jesus himself when he was with his disciples before he was arrested. He kind of instituted this thing, like he broke bread and said, this is my body broken for you. Whenever you eat it, remember me. And the same with the wine. This is my blood poured out for you and for many. Whenever you drink it, remember me. So he kind of told his friends to do it. So that's the first reason why it's important for me. And it was, the believers from the very beginning did it, and it's gone on through the church all those 2,000 years. So it's an important part of being a Christian. It personally reminds me of the cost that Jesus paid to bring me into God's family. So when the bread is broken, it's quite dramatic when they do that at the front. It reminds me that his body was broken. And when the wine is poured out, it reminds me that his blood flowed out because he was willing to take a punishment that I couldn't take. And that's the price to bring me into God's family. And I love the fact that I don't just do it on my own at home, but we always do it when we're together in church. Like, family life is about experiencing highs and lows. And I think we're quite often bonded when we've had a great time together, and then we have a serious time together. It kind of gives us a deeper bond. So we might go out on a church picnic. We might, have fun days in church and do great things together, but then we have these serious moments as well, and it's just a shared experience that kind of gives us a deep meaning to our church family life, and so it's special for that reason as well.
Brilliant, thanks. So the first reason that you gave, you talked about the fact that communion is mentioned in the Bible. One thing that students have to do in RE is link kind of concepts in the course to what we call sources of authority. That can be Bible verses, it can be church teachings, etc. But we really essentially we want to know what backs up people's beliefs and practices on a certain issue. So when looking at the Bible or other sources of authority, which verse could you maybe pick out one or two that really kind of back up your view or encourage you that you're doing the right thing when you're taking communion?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously, there's the accounts of when Jesus instituted this with his followers. They're great to look at because we've got his exact words that he said. But when I'm taking communion for myself, I think of something that was said about Jesus maybe 750 years before he was born, and it looked forward to the time that Jesus would be on the cross. So for me, that shows that this was always part of God's plan, that he was going to be on the cross, and it was going to be the time when God took the punishment for mankind. And so there's the verse in Isaiah 53, it's verse 6, and I've written it down. It says, "We all, like sheep, have gone astray, turned each one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." And so that's very clearly laid out, sort of hundreds of years before Jesus was born, that he was going to do this, and it was going to save his people. And it reminds me that if he hadn't done it, if he hadn't taken the punishment for me, I would have to pay that price myself. And that, looking at the broken body and the poured out blood, I couldn't have survived that. So I'm very grateful that he's done it. And that links with the things that Jesus said, the last two things he said on the cross. He said, he cried out a quote, actually. I mean, how amazing to have the presence of mind to call out a quote. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that's pointing to the fact that God had turned his back on Jesus because of all the darkness, all the wrongdoing that had been put on him. God turned away from him. And then he said in a loud voice, "It is finished." And I think a lot of people looking at him would have thought he's saying, "I am finished," because it's the very last thing he said before he died. But he's actually saying that the process that God laid out 750 or more years ago, more actually, but was talked about in that sheep quote, I've completed it. It is finished. I have paid in full. And that is amazing to think that God's plan carried through for centuries and was completed in that moment.
Brilliant, thank you. So in terms of celebrating communion today, in different churches, there's a whole spectrum of Christian churches and beliefs. And some people believe in what's called transubstantiation, which means that when they take communion, they might call it Eucharist or Mass in those traditions, that it actually somehow becomes the body and blood of Christ. And other people maybe on another end of the spectrum, they take it as a memorial that we're doing this because we're remembering something that happened either at the Last Supper or on the cross. And there's also, obviously, with everyone, there's quite a lot of space in between. I wondered where you fell on that spectrum. Maybe you could expand a little bit about why.
Yeah, great. So, well, Salway is an evangelical church, so we're not such a formal church as Anglican or Roman Catholic or Orthodox. I've already mentioned that. And so we believe that it's a memorial meal. It's a sort of symbolic meal of remembrance. And so we don't believe in transubstantiation, that it becomes the essence of Christ, but that it's a remembrance of him. I just made some notes on this. I'll get my thoughts in order. So yeah, there are differences between different Christians. Some of us believe one thing and some of us believe the other. But for me, the key thing is that we do it. We're told to do it in the Bible, so we should be obedient. And I think it's that obedience to God's command that is the most important thing, rather than my personal view of it. When Salway was actually established, at first we were a brethren church, which is even less formal church than we are now. And they used to call it breaking of bread rather than Eucharist or communion. So it was like a sharing together as a family might do something around a meal table. So that's where we've come from. So for us to call it communion and do it as we do it now is relatively formal, believe it or not. But for me also, my husband's family have a Jewish background. Although my husband is a Christian believer, his mum was a Holocaust survivor. And so it's very important to us to remember that Jesus wasn't creating something brand new when he created this thing that he said, do this, when you do this, remember me. It was already an act of remembrance. It was the Passover. And he was there remembering with his disciples this symbolic meal when God rescued his people from Egypt, where they were slaves. And in order to do that, they had to sacrifice a lamb, one of their own lambs, and paint the blood on the door frame, on the wooden door frame of their house. And when they did that, and the angel of death who passed over that night, sent by God, saw the blood on the door frame, he passed over, hence the name Passover. But where, of course, the people had not done that, the Egyptian people, I'm sad to say, the angel of death visited each and every home, including the royal palace. No home that did not have the blood was left out. And so that's a time for them of tremendous celebration that they were spared from death. And that was what Jesus was remembering with his disciples. And when he took the cup, we know which cup it was. There are 4 cups. You'll know if you study the Passover and the Judaism, there are 4 cups. And Jesus took the one immediately after the meal, the 3rd cup. We know that. And that is the cup of thanksgiving and the cup of blessing. Yeah, he could have taken the one that represents the punishment, but he took the cup of thanksgiving and blessing to be the one that he used to say, whenever you do this, remember me. So for me, it also goes back to the Jewish tradition that it was an act of remembrance, and Jesus reinvented it, upcycled it, that's quite a trendy word, isn't it, into the Christian remembrance of the death of Jesus and the blood that covers us from the punishment of death. So yeah, for me, it's a thanksgiving cup rather than a sort of remembering, that emphasizing on the sacrifice. It's thanksgiving for what he's done.
Thank you so much. That's such an interesting perspective. I hadn't really thought of it like that, but I think that makes such a lot of sense to see it as the memorial meal in that way and bring in the Jewish kind of tradition. So last question, we've nearly come to the end of this. So this is principally aimed at GCSE students. Other people may watch, but in the GCSE exam, the largest marks come from a statement, and then you have to kind of evaluate it from both sides, or ways that different people might look at it. So we're giving everyone a statement, and we're asking just for one side, one opinion, just that might help. So your statement is, the communion or Eucharist is the most important of the Christian practices. Do you agree, and why or why not?
Well, I don't quite agree with that. I believe it's an important thing, but I don't believe it's the most central thing. For me, what it represents, what it reminds me of, is the most important thing, and that is the death and resurrection of Jesus on behalf of believers. And my response to that is the other important thing that kind of is more important than the actual remembrance in itself. So for me, there's a prayer at the end of the Anglican service that I actually find really helpful, and it says this: thank you for feeding us with the body and blood of your Son, Jesus Christ. Through him, we offer you our souls and bodies to be a living sacrifice. Send us out in the power of your Spirit to live and work to your praise and glory. So it's my response that is important, to live out my Christian faith, to show and share Jesus in the world, his love for people and his desire to support and help people, and to share the good news of what he's done for us. So the central thing about the communion is that it's a memorial. All around London where we live, there are statues and memorials to all kinds of great people and the things that they did, so that we don't forget, so that it's marked in history. And that's the importance for me of the communion, that it's a memorial that marks it so I don't forget, so that it puts my life in perspective. First of all, with regard to God, that I must remember this is what he did and I must be obedient in doing it. And secondly, with regards to the world around me, that I am called to give my life to show and share Jesus to others.
Thank you so much for that response, and for all your responses. You've been a brilliant guest to have, so thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Helen. It's been a pleasure.